So, the internet has lost its mind over the last few weeks, or months, or maybe even years. Pretty much since its inception, it's been slowly going further and further down the rabbit hole of insanity. But the most recent target of internet backlash and scorn has been The Last of Us Part 2, the latest game from Naughty Dog, and the follow-up to one of the most critically acclaimed video games of all time. As someone who has now completed the game in its entirety, I have my own thoughts, I have my own opinions, they may not align with yours, I have some good things to say and bad things to say, but I look forward to a robust and mature conversation down there in the comments section. In all seriousness, please keep it as civil as you can in the comments, guys. I know lots of people don't like this game, and believe me, there are plenty of reasons not to like it, but I don't want my comment section to become a torrent of toxicity, so please keep it civil and dignified. So, bit of backstory. I loved The Last of Us. I only played it about a year and a half ago, and I was worried that it wasn't going to live up to the hype. I mean, everybody was saying that this game was incredible, and I just struggled to believe them. I didn't want this to turn into another Dishonored-style situation. Yes, I think that game is overhyped. No, I didn't enjoy playing it. Please don't at me, any Dishonored fans that are out there. But of course, The Last of Us proved me wrong 1,000-fold. Despite some mechanics seeming buggy and irritating and the gameplay occasionally becoming repetitive, I loved the immersive characters, the refreshingly grim story, the post-apocalyptic world building, and the truly exquisite graphics. It's rightly called one of the greatest games ever made, so Part 2 definitely had a hard act to follow. The game picks up 5 years after the events of the first one. Following Joel's massacre of the Fireflies in his bid to save Ellie's life, the pair have settled down in a community in Jackson and are living in the good post-apocalyptic life until a strange group led by a woman called Abbey storms into the area and, in one of the most controversial scenes in gaming, murders Joel right before Ellie's eyes. Ellie then tracks them down to seek revenge, all the while the story twists and turns and veers around before coming to the final showdown between the two women. I've shaved a lot off of that summary for obvious reasons, and I will get to the finer points in a minute. If I were to summarize my thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2 in a single word, that word would be conflicted. On the one side of things, this game is packed full with gorgeous graphics, beautifully realized environments, immersive and borderline addictive gameplay, and some genuinely touching, impactful, and utterly raw moments featuring engaging characters both old and new. And at the same time, the pacing is terrible, the structure is a mess, there are far too many story beats that don't go anywhere, the gameplay, while fun in parts, can get repetitive in others, especially where the zombies are concerned, and the overall plotting made many emotional moments miss the mark entirely simply because of where they are positioned in the game. The Last of Us Part 2 has gotten a ton of hate from the online community. Some hate it for its pacing, others hate it because it kills off Joel, some hate it for other reasons. And no, I'm not going to pull a Neil Druckmann and say that anybody that disliked this game is a homophobe or a sexist or whatever, because that's obviously not helpful to the discussion, but anybody that tries to say that this game is crap because it features a lesbian front and center, or that it depicts a homosexual relationship or a trans character, can go to hell. There is nothing wrong with the game being woke by featuring diverse characters. It is not propaganda, and it is not forcing any agenda down your throat. If you think it is, then you are the problem, not the game. Simple as that. But the main thing people are criticizing in The Last of Us Part 2 is the story. Whether it be Joel's sudden death right in the first hour of gameplay, the out-of-nowhere shift to the perspective of the girl who killed him, Ellie's whole journey of revenge ending with her ultimately forgiving the same girl who killed her father figure, everybody has a different complaint. Or more complaints, plural. Personally, I liked a lot of directions that the story takes. I liked seeing Ellie go down this darker path. I liked seeing the consequences come from Joel's actions in the last game. I like the themes that the game explores, themes like revenge, forgiveness, the poisonous us versus them mentality, and the maxim that at the end of the day, despite all of our good intentions, people are just self-serving monsters who will do abhorrent things if the situation calls for it. It's miserable, it's grim as hell, and that's kind of of the point. It's the same dark and gritty theming as the first Last of Us. I don't understand why the game being grim as it is warrants criticism when that's the whole purpose of the post-apocalyptic genre. If you weren't depressed while watching Ellie and Abbey suffer real consequences for their revenge quests, then the game didn't do its job. But that being said, the story does have some big foundational problems. Compare Part 2's story with Part 1's. Joel is tasked with taking a girl that he doesn't know across most of America to a facility run by a group calling themselves the Fireflies. Over the course of their journey, Joel learns that Ellie is immune to the fungal parasite which doomed the planet, and the Fireflies seek to use her to create a cure. Everything from that point on is in service to that goal, getting Ellie to the Fireflies. While it diverts and goes into various side stories, they don't interfere with the character's main struggle. In fact, those side stories bolster it. The brutal encounters that Joel and Ellie go through solidify their bond, leading to Joel's ultimate decision in the end. Part 2, however, doesn't stick to this simple A to B storytelling. At first, it's about Ellie getting revenge on the people who killed Joel, except no, it's about the conflict between the wolves and the Seraphites, except no, it's about Abby trying to find her ex-boyfriend Owen after he killed one of his own comrades, except no, it's about Abby having to help out these turncoat Seraphites after one of them gets their arm broken, except no, now it's about the leader of the wolves being a totalitarian dick, except no, now it's about Abby getting revenge on Ellie for killing her friend, except no, it's about Ellie saving Abby from a group of slavers and learning to finally forgive her and While The Last of Us Part 2 had a clear-cut and well-paced narrative, Part 2 crams in a lot more characters, therefore a lot more plot, therefore a lot more narrative for the gamer to consume. The more content and story that you add, the more you stretch the audience's attention span. Stretch it too far, and you risk snapping it completely. You have to structure your story very carefully if you want to keep them engaged. And that brings me to my next big point. A complicated plot isn't necessarily a bad thing. Lots of games have convoluted structures where the player has to go and do this thing and then that thing in order to obtain this thing and so on and so forth. So what is it about this particular story that feels so disjointed? Part of the problem with a lot of criticisms of The Last of Us 2 is that people tend to be misconstruing story to mean plot, and these are two very different things. A story is the series of events within a narrative. A plot is how said events are arranged within the narrative, so as to reveal their dramatic, thematic, or emotional significance. Take, for instance, Back to the Future. The story revolves around Marty McFly traveling back in time to 1955 and having to find a way back home to 1985. But the order in which we see this story is integral to its effectiveness. Chronologically, the story would technically begin in 1955, as that is the earliest year that we see the film, and it is also when we see the events that would lead to Doc Brown inventing the time machine in 1985 and setting this whole thing in motion. But starting the movie here wouldn't lead to an engaging narrative, so instead the movie begins in 1985. That just makes way more sense. The narrative is arranged in such a way to maximize the story's potential. This is an example of good plotting. The story of The Last of Us Part 2 isn't the issue, the story structure is the issue. Oftentimes the events within the game feel disjointed and out of place because they aren't told in the right order. And by the right order, I mean the order which would elicit the greatest emotional response from the gamer. An example of what I mean is the game's bizarre decision to switch from Ellie's story over to Abby's right in the middle of the damn thing. After Joel's death, Ellie travels to Seattle to hunt down his killers, and over the next few days, she takes out each of Abby's friends one by one before Abby herself shows up looking to pay Ellie back. And then the game flashes all the way back to Abby's time in the Fireflies, and we get the reveal that her father was the surgeon who was working on Ellie at the end of the last game, and the next few hours are spent seeing what Abby did while Ellie was going around on her murder spree. This effectively resets the entire game right back to square one, because we're having to get reacquainted with new characters and new plots and new storylines after spending the last god knows how long doing the exact same thing in another story that is wholly separate from this one. And I do mean wholly separate. Ellie's story and Abby's story share little to no connections up until the last third of the game. The creators likely did this to show us the different perspectives of people living in this dismal post-apocalyptic world, but it just comes across as disconnected and haphazard. For the first half or so, the game had its groove. There were still problems in there, but the pacing felt consistent. We were with Ellie and Dina and Jesse, and we knew what the end goal was. Then, like a juggler adding one too many items into his act, the game throws in more characters and plots onto its load, and the whole thing ended up tumbling to the ground in a giant heap. Another example of what I mean would be the characters that Ellie ends up killing during her revenge spree. We see it all from her perspective, and then the game suddenly switches to Abby's perspective, and we go back to see what these characters were up to before Ellie did a little murder. That's right, the plot goes backwards to get the audience attached to its characters. Characters that we have already seen get brutally killed. This is why story structure matters. What's the point of getting to know a character if we've already seen the grisly fate which awaits them? How are we meant to empathize with Abby at all when you showed this before this? You put the plot points in the wrong order. As a result of that, we neither feel much when we kill the wolves as Ellie, nor when we get to know them on a personal level as Abby. The emotional impact of the narrative is diluted simply by the way that it is structured. Compare this to a very well-known film director who loves to tell his films out of order, Christopher Nolan. A lot of Nolan's filmography features movies that are told in a non-linear fashion, but in his case it's motivated. In Memento, the events of the story feel awkward and disjointed because that's how the main character is experiencing them. It puts the audience in his shoes. He is confused and unsure what's happening to him, and therefore so are we. This is an effective use of non-linear storytelling, as it bolsters the narrative's effectiveness and engages us with the plot. In The Last of Us Part 2, however, the non-linear narrative doesn't really serve much purpose. It just grinds the story's momentum to a halt and prevents us from forming proper attachments to what's going on or the people who are experiencing it. Taken on their own, the actual events of the game aren't that bad. Joel killing Abby's father, Abby and her survivor friends joining a group called the Wolves and hunting Joel down, Ellie going off to get revenge, Ellie killing Abby's friends, Abby meeting and helping Lev, the climactic battle between Ellie and Abby where Ellie ultimately forgives her. These are excellent character beats and plot points on their own. What makes them not work so well is how they fit together. Take Abby's first flashback with her father. Imagine if the game began with this, instead of just shoving it right into the middle of the narrative. We meet this new person, we see that she has a dad who loves animals and has a good heart, and then a guy called Owen comes in and explains that the girl is here, she's immune, you need to do surgery right away, doc. And we, the audience who play the first game, immediately go, oh fuck, we know how this is gonna play out. This sets up one of the game's principal protagonists and antagonists and highlights the primary themes of revenge and its consequences. This sounds like a much better intro, doesn't it? Instead of cutting the game into two halves, why not mix Ellie and Abby's stories together? We get day one in Seattle from Ellie's perspective, then day one in Seattle from Abby's perspective, and just carry that on all the way through to the end. Maybe we could see Abby interacting with characters like Owen and Mel and Nora and the rest of the wolves in her chapters, only for us to brutally murder them in Ellie's, thereby making us feel that much more conflicted about what we're doing. Ellie and Abby's story needed to have a real impact on one another. We need to see these two rivals have, well, a rivalry. When presented as they are in the finished product, both Ellie and Abby's stories kind of felt a bit incomplete. For me, this is nowhere better demonstrated than in the fight between Ellie and Abby in the theater. Even after the hours we spent playing as Abby, we have got no incentive to root for her over Ellie during this fight. When you're forcing the player to try and kill the character that we're most attached to in the whole game, our hearts just aren't gonna be in it. A different way I thought this fight could play out is if you swapped between Ellie and Abby. Like at first the game forces you to play as Abby trying to kill Ellie, and then it switches you over to Ellie trying to kill Abby, and then you just go back and forth with the two women just brutalizing each other until Abby finally defeats and ultimately spares as her rival. If the game's structure was better and the stories were interlinked more organically, we would feel a lot more conflicted in this fight, but as it stands, I doubt I would find a single player on the planet who wasn't rooting for Ellie to blast this girl in the face during this confrontation. Rearranging the story would help the overall pacing as well as get us to connect much better with the characters. A lot of people have been hating on Abbey, which I don't entirely blame, but if the intro began with her grieving over her father's death, a death that we ourselves happily caused in the last game, wouldn't it be more understandable when she, you know... Even this event is something that could have been moved or altered to better pace the game's story. Imagine if instead of killing off Joel right in the beginning, Abby and the wolves kill Tommy in an attempt to get Joel. They fail in their mission, kill Tommy instead, and are forced to retreat as reinforcements from Jackson arrive. Then, instead of Tommy going to get revenge, Joel is the one that goes after them, leaving Ellie behind because he doesn't want her to get hurt, and then she has to go after him to bring him back. Then, at about the first quarter mark, Ellie and Joel reunite only for Joel to die right in front of her. Then the rest of Ellie's story would be about her hunting down Abby and the others and getting progressively more and more traumatized from her actions, eventually leading to her learning how to forgive Abby. That one small change would improve the pacing, the character arc, and make the plot feel more cohesive while not changing a ton about the story itself. And yes, the game does need to end with Ellie forgiving Abby in some sense. That's the game's main thesis. I don't understand how people can't grasp that concept. Ellie's quest for revenge is clearly framed as a bad thing in the game because it leads to so many nasty consequences, both for her and for Abby. So her character arc is learning to move past the need for revenge and finding forgiveness. In fact, let's just take a look at a quote from an admittedly superior game.
This path you walk, vengeance, you will find no peace. I know.
This is the painful lesson that Ellie has to go through, and by the end of the game, she has finally learned it, albeit with some big consequences. Funny, it's almost as if those scenes of Ellie being traumatized from brutally murdering her enemies, including a pregnant woman, was meant to mean something. Maybe that revenge just ain't worth it, almost as if that's the whole point of the story. But again, cutting back to what I have been saying throughout this video, what good is that point if the structure isn't strong enough to carry it? The Last of Us Part 2 is a perfect example of how plot and structure can make or break a narrative. This story had the potential to be really impactful, to hit us where it hurt the most, to be a worthy follow-up to one of the greatest games of all time. But thanks to the messy way said story is told, it doesn't quite hit the mark. And that is what makes it so frustrating. Not the fact that Joel gets killed, not the fact that Ellie forgives Abby by the end, but that the plot does not have a sound enough structure to support these events. All the pieces were there, you just put them in the wrong order. A few small changes, a few tiny adjustments, a little trimming of the fat, and the game could have been a masterpiece. As it stands, it only manages to be a fundamentally flawed, if still occasionally enjoyable, experience. I still had fun with the gameplay, the graphics and environments are still gorgeous to look at, and there are still elements in the story which I found to be gut-wrenching, heartbreaking, and even beautiful in a tragic way. Do the good elements outweigh the bad ones? That's really up to the individual. I'm still conflicted as all hell, and honestly, that's okay. I'm fine with that. Contrary to popular belief, it is possible for a thing to be both good and bad, which is why I hold to my assessment that The Last of Us Part 2 is a beautiful, compelling, utterly disjointed, poorly paced, and haphazardly written mess. And I honestly can't think of a better way to put it than that.